a new setup for us. We haven't done this way before. So, I'm going to continue on with some of the themes that the Rabbi discussed that applied specifically to Leadville. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Leadville, so to give you a small bit of context, the first white settlers to get up in this general neighborhood arrived around 1860 when gold was discovered over here in California Gulch. And the prospectors had worked their way up the Arkansas River Valley, panning for gold. They got up this far. There was a very substantial gold rush up here then, maybe as many as 10,000 people. And amongst them were just 2 or 3 Jews that we know of, the most prominent of whom was Wolf Londoner. We'll be coming back to talk about him. And that was also the gold rush that brought the Tabors here, Horace Tabor, who also set up camp over here in our city. And that original gold rush faded away. They didn't find another lode. And so having done a fair amount of digging and hydraulic mining up along the gulch, people drifted away and left a very small population, but Horace was amongst them, so that's germane at a later point. In the middle of the 1870s, an enormous amount of silver was discovered up here, and that's what really drove the rush to this area and the growth of Leadville itself. And that starts in about 1876, 1877. And by about, in 1880, we know, according to the census, there are about 26,000 people living in the county. We're not sure the census is terribly accurate, but that gives us some idea of the size of the community. And within the course of those first 2 or 3 or 4 years, a brand new modern, very rich city develops here. So this is a big metropolis, and in some ways rivals Denver. It's the second largest city, and probably the richest city in the state for a few years in the late 1870s and 1880s. Then Leadville enters into a period of it transitions from being a boom town into becoming an industrial community. And so the prospectors sort of fade away, and what you find up here are quite a few mines, owned oftentimes by outside capital. The mines over time tend to consolidate. The prospectors really don't have the money to develop these mines, and so they sell out to people who can afford to really bring in the kinds of equipment and the workforces necessary. And I should tell you that mining at that point was fairly sophisticated, and they used power tools. There were pneumatic tools up here, steam engines, and very quickly there was electricity up here. This is one of the first cities in America to be highly electrified. So as it makes this transition, the population declines. And so we move from prospectors to really people who are wage laborers for the most part. And so having peaked in about 1879, 1880, the population then declines. In 1893, America experiences the silver panic, the panic of '93. Silver is demonetized. Leadville and all of Colorado take a big hit, and the whole country has a depression. So it's a complicated event, but this is another step in Leadville's diminishment, I guess you might say. But Leadville does not go under then. Having missed the mother lode for gold in the 1860s, it's discovered again while they're looking for silver. So Leadville is not just producing silver, but it's also producing gold. And this is actually a very rich mineral belt underneath us. And so there's things like zinc, copper, lead, of course, and other metals. So Leadville actually switches in the 1890s to mining a lot of zinc and gold, and not so much silver. During the First World War, the Climax mine opens up, the molybdenum mine that you will pass through on the way here. That stays open until the 1980s and sustains Leadville. So that's a very quick overview of what's happening in the background. Now, as the rabbi pointed out, while we have two trends coming together here. One is the development and the industrialization of the American West that takes place during the second half of the 19th century. And it's not just Leadville that's booming. All of the American West is growing very dramatically. And there are places like Leadville, in Nevada, Montana, and other places. But it's not just mining. There's also a huge amount of agriculture as the Great Plains are developed. And with the transcontinental railroad connecting both coasts in 1869, there's also an enormous amount of commerce across the Pacific. So we have become in that era a truly continental country, and the West is growing like crazy. At the same time, we have the beginning and then the acceleration of the Jewish immigration to America, and these two things meet here in Leadville. So in the very earliest phase, in 1860, there's a handful of Jews in Colorado. There's a few in Denver, and I believe there's a congregation that's established in Denver right around 1860. That, of course, doesn't happen up here. There's not that kind of concentration, but we do know that there are 2 or 3 Jews up here, even in the earliest era. And then they fade away along with everybody else, but with the boomtown developing in the 1870s, Jews come to Leadville along with everybody else. And we believe, for example, that by about 1880, there are nearly 300 Jews living in Leadville. And they represent something like 1% of the population, which would have been a bit more than the national average, although I wouldn't get too wrapped up in that. So, and again, the rabbi and I have overlapping points. The Jews that come here originally in the 1870s, early 1880s, are almost all German Reform. And we see that in our poster boy, who we look at now, David May. We like him a lot, for lots of reasons. As historians, you can come in. Can I ask you to leave the dog outside though? You can tie it up if you want. David May, in many ways, is prototypic. I was going to say, we do a lot of historical research here, and one of the reasons we like David May is there's a lot of data. He's nicely documented. And one of the problems historians, this is a bit of an aside, there's always an accusation that historians, rich and famous people, prominent people, and that sort of thing. And there's several reasons for that. First of all, those people tend to be very influential, and so there's things to say about them. But also, those are the people that are documented. So those are the ones you can find out things about. And so you sort of get shoved in that direction. But he is also, in many ways, very prototypic. His family sends him to America from the Rhineland in 1864. He's 16 years old. I doubt that many of us would send our kids across the Atlantic. Also, this is during the Civil War. On an old sail ship, and just send your kid off on a several-month journey to the New World. But he does have a connection in, of all places, Cincinnati, where his uncle lives. So he gets to his uncle's, and the uncle teaches him how to be a peddler and a dry goods merchant. And he has a career in Ohio and Indiana, and he works the business. And I think he does moderately well, and has an interest in one of these shops, and sells out, and comes west in, correct me if I'm wrong, the experts back there, I think it was in 1877?
77 or 78, yeah.
Right there, just when Leadville started to take off. There are maybe 2 stories about why he came out here, one of which was that he had respiratory problems. And then there's another that maybe he was just coming out here for adventure and opportunity. I might make a small aside about the respiratory problems, and this was particularly pertinent, not so much here, but in Denver. A large proportion of the Jewish population in Denver moved to Denver a bit later, around the turn of the 20th century, to take the cure, tuberculosis cure. There were at least 2 big hospitals down there, National Jewish and the Jewish Consumptive Relief Society. You know, they certainly weren't the only hospitals that dealt with tuberculosis. But a big part of the Jewish migration, particularly to Denver and Far East, was a consequence of that. Anyway, David made it, I don't think, had tuberculosis, he might have had some asthma. Anyway, he's out here right at the beginning, and I believe he starts off trying to mine a little bit, gives that up fairly quickly, and goes back to his original source of income, becomes one of the leading merchants in town, dry goods. He originally has partners, which just seems to be fairly typical, but I believe he also came out here with some capital to start with. He sets up shop initially down at the end of Harrison, and in a couple of years kind of gets rid of his partners, develops a new one, and moves a couple blocks up to the vacant lot that's immediately at the end of the street and across, is where David May's main store was. He was living over here behind the church on the next block. His neighbor, the Schoenbergs, a very busy family up here. They have a daughter, Rosa, and he marries her and begins a dynasty in his own right. So this Jewish community here is not just young men, although predominantly I think they are. But there's also family life up here, and then actually quite a bit of social and cultural things going on here. He is increasingly prosperous up here, and we know that because from here he takes trips back east. He goes to Europe in his later years here, and he's a well-respected member of the community. He's appointed and then elected county treasurer, and he's vice president of this congregation. The Jewish community up here becomes, I think, more and more cohesive. Originally, Jews met for prayer in meeting rooms or in homes, in small groups. We know they came together for the High Holy Days at the Schoenberg Opera House, also down here. And by 1884, the Jewish community was sufficiently substantial, they were able to build this building. We'll come back to the history of the building a little later, but David May is vice president of the congregation, and as such, he was the recipient of the deed from Horace Tabor, wherein he donates the land that we're standing on to David May for the benefit of the congregation. We have the original deed on the wall back there. So, an important person in town. By the mid and late 1880s, it's starting to become evident that the future is not in Leadville, it's going to be somewhere else. And I told you the population starts to decline. We see that also amongst the Jewish community, particularly the ones that I think maybe are a little bit more aggressive. Can tell that their sales are starting to taper off a little bit, and that they're probably time to move on, greener pastures. David Mace leaves here about 1887, 1888, although he maintains some relationship with the community. And he comes back again in 1896, where he is honored at the Ice Palace and given the keys to the city. So he follows this sort of very typical trajectory and moves on to where he thinks he's going to have greater opportunities. He goes down to Denver, his business continues to expand, he absorbs Daniels and Fisher, becomes May D&F. As his business gets bigger and bigger, he eventually moves to St. Louis and passes away in the 1920s, having established the May Corporation, which then eventually becomes public, but initially passes on to his son, who was born up here. And we know that a bris was performed up here for the son. There was a traveling mower who went around to different towns up here and performed the services.
I might add that from Moab, they would do it like a group at a time, so it wasn't always have a day. But when the mohel ride, that's going to need to be circumcised and circumcised.
Also, feel free to ask questions or interrupt me or anything. I'm very comfortable with that.
So you said it was electrified. How was it electrified back then? Was it a hydro or?
No, that's a good question. I guess it was steam turbine. By the way, David May was one of the incorporators of the electric company, I can recall. Another aside. Having restored the synagogue and turned it into a museum and all, our major function now in terms of labor hours is researching and documenting and writing biographies of all the Jews that lived in Leadville before the First World War. So this is about 900 individuals, about 180 or 90 surnames. And some of the older biographies that we wrote, and David May was one of the early ones, we're rewriting now because we have much better access to data than we used to. The State Historic Society has been digitizing all of the old newspapers in the state, and it's now possible to do digitized searches so we can find things we were never able to find before. This is also true for census records and some other things. So we're able to do a lot better research than we originally did, and we are just now wrapping up our rewrite of David May with many more details, and our expert is sitting in, Trevor is sitting in the back, so I have to refer to them. So, we have David May who follows this very prototypic path as an immigrant who comes to America, who learns his trade, who takes advantage of the opportunities that he finds, and winds up being enormously wealthy and successful. So most of the Jews who came up here did not wind up fabulously wealthy and led lives very, I would say, for the very typical middle class sort of life. So, David May. Now, the other big name up here was Guggenheim. Somewhat different path. The patriarch, Mayor Guggenheim, immigrates from Switzerland in 1848, winds up in Philadelphia, also dry goods and lace. Becomes moderately prosperous in Philadelphia, and by 1880, when he gets out, he doesn't so much get out to Leadville, he's sold an investment in Leadville. He does come out here to examine it, look at the mine. It's a flooded mine up here, about a mile up the California Gulch, and the mine itself in the present day is bisected by our mineral belt. So people who ride their bicycles around the mineral belt ride through the Guggenheim property and then up the opposite wall. He is an outside investor. He's a capitalist. I don't believe he ever touches a pickaxe. And he is typical, in a way, of what happens to a great many of the mines up here, which is prospectors can't develop them. They do need outside capital, and a lot of that comes from the East and even from Europe in some cases. So, he doesn't live here. He stays in Philadelphia. We do know that he sends one of his sons out here, Benjamin, who gets out here, I think it was 1882, and I think he was still in college then. It's my recollection that he was studying mining at Columbia. And we believe the old man sent him out here to learn about real life. And he's out here, he's a little hard to trace, Benjamin is, although we have a nice photograph of him. And this is the AY Mini Mines. There's actually a pair of mines that the Guggenheims bought that belong to the same person. The son is out here for maybe 2 years. I'm not certain that he's out here continuously. It may have been that he was just out here during summers. So he's a little, their footprint here is actually fairly light. And then it goes back. But the mine that they bought becomes enormously valuable and is producing a huge amount of revenue. The Guggenheims looked at this strategically and realized that mining itself is not really where they wanted to be in. They wanted to be in the refining business. And they take their profits from here, and they go into the refining business. They buy refineries. Now, they also buy other silver mines, sometimes in Mexico and other places, as their empire gets larger and larger. So by 1900, 20 years after they make their first investment, they become the copper trust. and are enormously powerful in mineralogy in America, and amongst the wealthiest families in New York. I'm sorry, in America. And have moved from Philadelphia to New York. And I suppose probably also a sign of their affluence. As part of their burgeoning business, they acquired the Arkansas Valley Smelter, which was about a mile down the road here, which was the largest smelter in this area. Now this, so they have in the end two entities here, the mine and the smelter. We have some photographs of the smelter back here. It looks exactly like one of Carnegie's steel mills. In fact, smelters do the same thing. They melt metal. This is a big industrial operation. And Leadville by the 1890s, 1900s, looks just like Pittsburgh on the upper Arkansas. This is an industrial community. So Benjamin leaves, go back to New York, he enjoys the high life, sets up on East 72nd Street, has a nice place, and is a passenger on the Titanic coming back on his fatal journey. This is a, I think, moderately well-known story. He's traveling with his mistress. And his valet, and the mistress has a maid. And the story is, and I'm not prepared to document this, but the story is that as the ship hits the iceberg and starts to go down, the valet and Guggenheim make sure that the mistress and the maid are on one of the lifeboats. They then retire to their rooms, dress for dinner, and are last seen in the Grand Salon enjoying a cognac and a cigar as the ship goes down. I'm not sure who the witness was. And the last part of the story, and I'm not going to call it history, the last part of the story is that the family were careful to take care of the mistress and keep the whole thing discreet. That's the Guggenheim connection here. So these are the two famous names, May and Guggenheim. But a much more typical case would be the Bear brothers, Adolf and Julius. Adolf and Julius were in the liquor business, and Jews dominated the wholesale liquor business up here. And you'll hear me talking about Jews as merchants and as tradespeople and that sort of thing. And that was predominantly what they did up here. They were not, for the most part, miners. And in fact, we know that several, maybe quite a few Jews speculated in mining stock, which was a form of gambling up here that I think was fairly popular. And we know even that several Jews got the mining bug at one point or another, and actually went out and dug holes in the ground. But they all had day jobs. and none but the Guggenheims made much money in the mining business. The Bear family came over here also, German. They get to the United States in the late 60s, 1860s, early 70s, and are up here also fairly early on. They set up their shop up here on the corner of 5th and Harrison, immediately adjacent to the county courthouse, so they have a steady supply of customers. And they had quite a prosperous business there for about 15 years or so. We were fortunate to get from a descendant the wedding pictures of Adolf and Matilda, which we have here. We also have, in one of our photos up on the wall, a picture of the Bears at home on West A Street. What's interesting about these photographs, in my mind, is, of course, they're very formal, but when you look at how they were dressed and the not so much in this picture, but the picture of them in their living room, it's decorated in a very high Victorian manner, sort of cluttered up and heavy and musty, and they're wearing very formal clothes. And I think this points very strongly, we'll come back to it again, to the assimilationist aspect of this experience. These people very quickly adopt all of the local ways. We believe they're very fluent in English. We know they write English without any problem. They dress and behave like everybody else, and they do moderately well up here. Now, they also have a little bit of humor. You can't really see it, but they're selling whiskey and beer and cigars, and they spell cigars, S-E-G-A-R. We know that they actually know how to spell cigar properly. And this is a little joke that's in the picture. I'm sorry, the definition isn't good enough. So, now, they weren't all whiskey merchants. We have Jacob Heberger, journalist. His story is a little different. He's actually born in New York, I think maybe New Jersey. And his father passed away when he was quite young. This would have been in the early 1870s. So his mother comes out here, and she has a brother who's a doctor down in Salida. And she stays with him. And he is actually born in Oppenheimer, but the uncle adopts him and brings the family up here, up from the Salida area, and settles in here and becomes one of the few Jewish professionals up here. In this era, this first generation, they're not doctors and lawyers and professors and that sort of thing. No, they're mostly merchants. And like Dr. Heberger is a physician, practicing physician, and he sends Jacob down to the University of Colorado for a college degree. Not so common back then, although we do see other families sending their kids back east to college. We know, for example, the Greenwalds send their daughters back east for their education. So they're very careful on this point when they can be. He gets his education down at CU, comes back here, goes to work for the Herald Democrat, and eventually becomes the owner of the Democrat, and unfortunately dies at a young age in his mid-30s, in the early 1900s of, I forget what disease it was, and tragically ends his career in our cemetery. I should mention that the cemetery was opened in 1880, so that precedes the synagogue by 2 to 4 years. But he's more an example of the second generation transitioning to this other stereotype about the Jewish profession. So they start off as merchants and become professionals, and he is that part of the story. Wolf Londoner. I like Wolf. Wolf is up here in 1860, and he's selling stuff to the miners up here in the very first wave. So that fades away, and he goes down to Denver, and there's a business down there, and he's got 3 or 4 brothers that are helping him out. And when that bill kicks back in again, in the 1870s, Wolf is back here, and he sets up here on East Chestnut, and has a grocery store, along with 2 or 3 of his brothers, and they seem to be coming back and forth quite a lot to Denver. I should mention that the railroads got up here in 1880, and fairly quickly thereafter it became feasible to go back and forth to Denver on a fairly regular schedule, and we do see people going down to Denver for long weekends, for example. Because the transportation system has gotten quite good. It's the old saw, water flows uphill towards Money, where the railroads follow the water. Actually, that's literally true. They came up originally up the Arkansas. And actually, that's the most common kind of development we see all over America, is that the very early people coming to the new frontier, almost everywhere, follow the river. And if you look at something like I-80, follows the Platte. So first you have the Platte River, then you have the Oregon Trail, then you have the Union Pacific, then you have I-80, and there are spots up in Wyoming, you can see all 4 of these things at the same time. You can see the old ruts from the trail. So Wolf is up here. We have, this is his store here, Londoners, and they do pretty good business. But his first love appears to be Denver. He goes back down there, and I think it was in 1888, he gets himself elected mayor of Denver. I think the first Jewish mayor of Denver. And unfortunately, there were some peculations in the election, and about 2 years later, he got thrown out of office. And highly unusual in that era, because every election was corrupt. Because for some reason, he was the one that got into trouble over these things. Stole the election. And he was involved with some famous people. And Sophie Smith was one of his brothers then. And I think Bat Masterson also was one of his pals. So he was kind of a glamorous guy at this time, and fairly prominent. And then he kind of fades away after that. Now, this is the Ulmer family. These people get to live a little bit later. And this is an example. So far we've been dealing with German Jews. And you recall, it's the German Jews that start coming over first. But the immigration from Europe is moving progressively further east. And so the first gang of the German Jews, then we have the Austro-Hungarians, and Austro-Hungary then included southern Poland, Galicia, where there's a lot of Jews. And then the third and last wave, of course, are the Russians. The Russians never really get up here. There's some, but Leadville's time has passed by the time the Russians really start coming in. The Ulmers hail from Poland, southern Poland, and they get here late 1880s, and they're grocers. And Herman sets up, he's living over here he's living on the other side of the alley back here. So he's right next to the shore, and he peddles groceries. He passes away in about 1910, and his grocery wagon flips over on him. And Hannah leaves and goes down to Victor Cripple Creek, where she has a daughter, and passes away there. But they're both interred in the cemetery here. And their great-grandson, Stan Ulmer, was a state historic librarian. And we started the foundation up back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Stan did a huge amount of the initial research for us. Being the state historic librarian, he knew where everything was down there, and was just wonderfully helpful and supportive. And he has joined his great-grandparents now, some years ago. So we miss him. This is Stan here.
I'm just going to comment on the facial hair. Now, facial hair also tells you a lot about where people came from.
Yes. The Eastern Europeans were bearded, the Germans not so much. And these mustaches were very popular in the era. So you had this sort of mixing of fashion as opposed to tradition. So actually a lot of men had mustaches in that era. So, there is, actually Stan has a cousin still down in Denver. And we have several families who still were no longer in Leadville, but are on the Front Range. And we do contact them from time to time. This is a drawing. Actually, look at that, I suppose. And unfortunately, you can't read it well enough. But it shows several Jewish businesses here. Cheap Joe's Clothing, that's Joe Schoenberg. And the Schoenbergs were partners with the Mannys for a while. But they also had their own shops. The Opera House sort of faded away. And we have, I wish I could read it. This is Ben Loeb's place. We'll be talking about Ben in a minute or two.
Is that any relation to the stock market loads?
I don't think so. A lobe's fairly common name. You're talking food lobes in New York. Those lobes. Those lobes were very big in New York in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. They were amongst the richest bankers in New York. And there's still a bunch of lobes hanging around. It's a fairly common name. And this Ben Loeb, we'll be talking about him next slide. So let me come back to him. And then there's Moritz Mankus, who was a tailor. So this is Harrison Avenue, And while this is not actually an accurate representation, we cannot find in any one year all these stores are in the same place. They're on different blocks, some of them. So this is a little artistic license. It gives you some idea of the density of Jewish businesses on Harrison Avenue, particularly the 300 block here, is probably more than half Jewish. I should tell you that this is the kind of research that we'll be doing in the next phase, after we have finished our biographies of the individuals. We're then going to go back and look at that database and try to define and maybe even map out these locations. So Ben Lowe, just wait a minute. Wrong slide, there. Ben Lowe. Ben Lowe's one of our favorites. Ben Lowe came here also from Germany, comes in through Houston. Houston, it turns out, is a big port, and there's a fair number of Jews hanging around in Texas in general. And I think he had 2 brothers. And the brothers stay in Texas, he comes up here. And he starts off kind of in the restaurant business, but he very quickly moves into what he referred to as variety theater. And then, so he's down here on Harrison Avenue in the 100 block, and he has this large variety theater on the ground floor, and then upstairs he has a bordello. And the 2 mix all the time. And he's very well known and popular in town. He's apparently a bit of a gangster girl. And just a fair number of customers. And there's a story around about how at one point, Leadville used to have a lot of parades. Social life was very different in the old days. And one of the things we see in our research is there are just all kinds of public events, picnics, meetings, banquets, parades. This is before television. So people would get together and do all kinds of things. And so they'd have parades here for any excuse at all. And when they did, then we'd put the girls in a wagon and parade them up and down the avenue. He also, as one of his promotions, had trade tokens. Trade tokens were fairly popular in the late 19th century, probably maybe till around the time of the First World War. Typically, this would mostly be in saloons, but oftentimes the saloon keepers, instead of giving, so you buy a nickel beer or a shot, you give them a quarter, they give you back 20 cents change in trade tokens, which you can only spend in that establishment, or maybe they can pass them out as advertising. And so that's what Ben did. Ben had trade tokens. Ben Lowe, Leadville, Colorado. On the back, this is not a particularly easy one to read, but it says, good for one of those things. It turns out that one of those things had a face value of 5 cents. And actually, there's quite a few events, trade tokens around. We have several, and I've seen several others in advertising and that kind of thing. So he apparently passed out quite a few of these. But Leadville's fortunes decline over the years, and he eventually goes out of business in the 1890s, around 1900, and passes away in 1912. And the Jewish community buries him in the cemetery, and they write the brothers down in Houston a little note. They send us a little something, and how about a headstone? And the brothers write back and they say, forget about it. I don't think they approved of what Ben had been doing. And the cemetery is remarkably well documented, but we don't know what Ben is.
So if a beer was 5 cents back then, how much was the upstairs entertainment?
Well, that's the point.
One of those things.
One of those things.
I think the beer was like 5 cents back then.
Yeah.
I'm sitting wrong.
Well, you're making it very social. Well, I don't know much about the economics of that, but another one of our side, Leadville was said to have had the largest red light district between Denver and San Francisco, and this was not a happy life for the ladies that worked there. There was a whole alley over here, Stillborn Alley. There were a lot of suicides, a lot of violence, drugs, It was not such a great way to make a living. Now, there were some more glamorous cases. So, for example, there was a lady over here where my attorney's office is now, and she had quite a nice bordello. And she passed away about 1885, and she died intestate. And it turns out that you recall David May was the vice president, but he wasn't the big knock at him. There was a guy named Mannheimer, brothers actually. Mannheimer were concerned about was president of the congregation, not vice president. He was also a county commissioner. And the Mannheimers, also German Jews, came over in the 1860s in New York. They came out here in 82 and set up shop right up on the corner here where the food carts are. And I think did quite well very quickly, and I think were fairly well capitalized. So he's a very prominent member of the community and gets himself elected county commissioner. So when Molly May, who is not related to David, when she passes away intestate, Mr. Mannheimer is nominated as executor of her estate. And this is considered a very prestigious appointment. He's the most sort of honorable and reputable person would get this appointment. He's got a wife and kids and everything, and now he's running one of the fanciest bordellos in town. And he does this for, I don't know, 6 months or so until they can settle the estate. So this was not, so nice ladies maybe didn't do this, but this was not beyond the pale either. So this was a common thing back then. And subject to another discussion maybe. Anyway, poor Ben was one of the more popular people in town in the late 1880s, early 1890s. When he passes away in 1912, is destitute, and according to the newspaper, his funeral was attended by only 3 or 4 people. So, in this life, Sands brothers. Jake Sands actually comes over here from northern, it's now northern Poland, it was then Prussia. And winds up initially in Central City, where he's in business, dry goods. And his story is also a good one for us, because he comes over here in 1879 to set up shop. And he sets up shop in the then brand new Tabor Opera House. He's in the north face. There's an entrance, there's 2 stores on the side, he's on the north side. Horace Tabor is his landlord. And he has a girlfriend. His girlfriend is Baby Doe. He's come over, he brings her over here. It's part of his transition from Central City. And there's some interesting stories about their relationship back in Central City. But we're still working on documenting that. But there is a written rumor that she had a child with him who was stillborn. So we're going to try to chase that one down a little further if we can. But apparently that was noted in the newspapers. Harvey, the husband, was off mining somewhere while she was having an affair with Jake. Anyway, Jake comes over here, and we think, now there's multiple stories about how Baby Doe and Horace meet, but we think that Jake is the connection, that she meets Horace through Jake, because Horace is the landlord, and we think she's actually working a little bit in the store. So, and Horace is living in the house at that time, we think. So that connection. Anyway, the Sands brothers do fairly well. And this is a drawing, actually I think from a photograph, of their second location, which was the building next door, and is in what's now called the Hyman Block. So they have a successful business. This is from the early 1890s, this picture. So they're up here about 20 years. This is not the one I want to show you. I'm going to clean this out of order here. Let me see if I can find something. I'm going to go out of order. We might rearrange this thing. So the building I just showed you, the Hyman Block, which is still here. It's where the 100-mile race is headquartered now. The building that's there now, the Hyman Block, dates to 1890. Manny Hyman actually opened a shop, his bar, in about 1882 or 3, and ran the bar himself until about 1887. And this bar is the bar that was famous for Doc Holliday's residence and his last shooting. The last person that Doc Holliday ever shot was in Mannys Saloon. And he was then, that incident was brought to a halt by a fellow named Kellerman, who was also Jewish, and had worked, was working in Manny's bar, and worked in several other bars. He was apparently a very strong, powerful guy, who occasionally did get into fights with people, and Holiday was dishonored by Kellerman. So we have that. Manny sold the bar business in '87 to a fellow who lasted about 2 years, and then Manny takes the building back, the old building, which is a one-story building, and he tears it down, and he builds a two-story building. So he's not the bar business anymore, he's a landlord, much more honorable. And he's renting to the Sands Brothers downstairs. So, and we see this a lot. Jewish businesses move into Jewish properties. Jewish businesses sometimes take over other Jewish businesses. They take over each other's houses. There's this network that we see. So they're moving in and out of the same property. So the building is still there today, but it's not the original Hyman Saloon, contrary to some of the local myths. Okay, let me go back to, the Miller family. Also dry goods. Nathan Miller, it was from Vilnius. Comes over in 1890, so he's part of this second wave, the Austro-Hungarian gang. Although actually I think Vilnius at that time was part of Russia. Yes? So the theory's a little weak, but we're still moving east. He grew up in Vilnius, he studied to be a rabbi, and by the time he got to be 19, he decided he didn't really want to be a rabbi that badly, and he just assumed to go to America. And he winds up here in about 1890, finds a wife in England, if I remember, and they set up shop here, and they're in the dry goods business. But Nathan has the bug, and he wants to strike it rich, and he buys a mine, and he proceeds to mine. And to the best of our knowledge, he doesn't find much of anything, but we have Nathan here standing out in front of his mine. There are better photographs in the cabinet, display case over here. You can actually see them. This photo is actually from the late 1920s, so he doesn't give up. He keeps at it. And we have a companion photo with his son, who's also out there in the line. He has other children. Henry, his oldest son, who unfortunately was witnessing the dogfight up here in Harrison Avenue in about 1907. These two dogs are fighting out in the street. A sheriff's deputy comes by to break up the fight, pulls out his pistol, tries to hit the dog. Pistol goes off, hits Henry. Henry lingered for about 3 days. It was very tough on the family, and one thinks that if there had been modern medicine, he would survive. The mortality rates here were really very high, for the usual reasons. When I say usual reasons, by that I mean mostly infectious disease. And childbirth was very difficult. And then there were the accidents and stuff. We see this reflected in the cemetery. In the old section of the cemetery, half the people buried there are 10 years or younger. So the infant mortality rates are very high. Kids would get all kinds of diseases, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and they had dysentery and typhoid. And they just had all kinds of epidemics up there all the time. And there wasn't really much they could do about it. And we sort of forget how fragile life used to be. So that tragedy visited the Miller family. They have a daughter, Minette, two daughters, but Mannys Saloon we're concerned with. She's born here in the 1890s. She stays in Leadville. In fact, the whole Miller, well, the parents and Mannys stay in Leadville. The parents pass away here in the 30s. Mannys stays here, and she becomes a teacher, and then she is social services for Lake County. So she was the whole department. Social services wasn't quite as an elaborate enterprise then as it is now. And she was very fondly remembered by the older members of the community here. And so she passed away in 1981. And she was the last of the Jewish pioneers in Leadville. There are now no Jews living in Leadville who are related to anybody who was here back when. The nearest we have is Rob Filippi. William, do you know him?
Yes.
Okay. Rob's great-grandfather came to Leadville mid-1880s, French, had a Hungarian wife. We have some artifacts from the family in our case there. The grandfather was restaurants, hotels, he had a little resort. Leadville wasn't a big fancy place. It had suburbs and resorts. So if you got sick and tired of Leadville, you go down here to Silver Springs and hotels, you go down to Twin Lakes and Interlaken, spend a weekend down there, eating, drinking, and yachting, and whatever it is they did. Henry leaves here in the 1890s, but Rob's grandfather was born here. We have some infant photographs in 1887. The family leaves here, they go to Chicago, they have family this and that. And then Rob's grandfather, I guess it was in the late 1940s, remembering what a wonderful childhood he had up here, bought a cabin up in Frisco back when. And then I think the story goes that a few years later he was offered 2 or 3 blocks of downtown Frisco, which he bought for $5 a lot. And Rob is enjoying the consequences. So he's our nearest relative. So the Miller family, again, very typical. We were fortunate to find a granddaughter who's in a nursing home in Denver, and we were able to interview her a year ago, and get a bunch of family artifacts and some nice information. And we try to do that when we can, try to find some descendants. We also have a granddaughter who visited us. That generation, the grandchildren generation, is very old than me now, but she came up here from Nebraska for that. Share, whiskey merchants. What's interesting about this, aside from using another merchant on the 300 block up here, is you can see the whiskey barrels. So the whiskey would be delivered up here in barrels. The wholesalers would order up the jugs that you see here. They mostly came out of Denver. There were two or three kilns down there that make the jugs. Ship them up here. They decant them into the jugs, and then sell the jugs to the bars and anybody else that felt like they needed that much. Well, I say that sort of glibly, but one of the housing patterns up here in the old days, when the mines were going, a great many of the miners lived in dormitories up in the mines, not in town. They didn't go back and forth every day. They'd be up at the mine for a week, 6 days, whatever the work would be, and then they'd come down here and spend their money with Mr. Lowe. And you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned a while back that some of the children are 10-year-olds or younger. Was it a smelter putting out toxic fumes?
You bet. But I don't know that bothered anybody. Well, Leadville's been famous for the Superfund site for about 25 years, starting in the 1980s until just a few years ago, when they ran out of other people's money to declare victory. Leadville's full of heavy metals. It's not called Leadville for nothing. The the levels in the soil here are very high. We have cadmium, we have arsenic, we have all kinds of things. And I can tell you lots of horror stories, but I will also tell you, because Leadville has been an active community since its inception, we're very fortunate here. We have a whole generation of people, elderly people, that were born here. And we have many families, one of them back here, that have been living here 3 and maybe even 4 generations. And you'd be surprised how many of these people live to very advanced ages. And I remember when I first came here, I talked to one old boy down here who was in his 90s, back in about 1990s. And he told me about how they used to swim in the tailing ponds. So, and he was old enough to involve him. So, anyway, yes, Leadville is officially highly polluted, but it's not so clear that the pollution's a problem. What really is a problem up here in terms of public health is the altitude, low birth weight. Okay, Adolph. The shaders, there's shaders down in Denver still. And another prosperous German. Schloss, same story. Schloss Brothers also come here in the whiskey business. Their building is the yellow building directly at the end of the street up here when you look up the street. This photo is about 1905, we think. And this is where David May had his business, and the Sands, the Doc Holiday, all of that is down here, and then there's the opera house. So, and there were Jewish merchants facing them from across the street. Monheimer, Raleigh, Davies, and so forth. Or come back and visit anytime, and we have gruesome details and go on and on from the website.
Bill, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Folks.